All right, ready to dive deep into another case.
Always up for a good deep dive, especially when it involves a pivotal moment in FBI history.
This time we're going back to the Roaring '20s, the era of jazz, flappers, and, well, a whole lot of lawlessness thanks to Prohibition.
A time of great change and upheaval. And out of that chaos emerged some truly fascinating figures, both on the right side and the wrong side of the law.
Today we're focusing on one such figure, Martin James Durkin.
Durkin. A name that still sends chills down the spines of those familiar with early FBI history.
He was a notorious car thief, a smooth operator with a knack for deception and a dangerous streak of violence.
And most infamously, he holds the grim distinction of being the first person to kill an FBI agent in the line of duty.
We've got declassified FBI files and original newspaper clippings from the 1920s.
Those primary sources are like gold mines, offering us a glimpse into the past, the chance to piece together a story that's both thrilling and tragic.
So let's rewind the clock back to 1920s Chicago, the heart of the American underworld.
Picture bustling streets, smoky speakeasies, the rumble of Model Ts, and the shadow of gangsters lurking around every corner.
And it's here, amidst this volatile backdrop, that our story begins with the rise of Martin James Durkin.
He was born in Sligo, Ireland in 1901.
Imagine that, from the rolling green hills of Ireland to the gritty streets of Chicago.
His family had emigrated to America like so many others, seeking a better life.
The classic immigrant story. But Durkin's story took a very different turn, didn't it?
It did. Young Martin had a rebellious streak, a restless spirit that couldn't be tamed by traditional employment.
He was drawn to the allure of easy money, the thrill of living on the edge.
He shunned honest labor, opting instead for the fast cars and risky ventures of the criminal underworld.
And it all started with bootlegging, right? The illegal alcohol trade was booming during Prohibition.
Bootlegging was his entry point, a way to make quick cash and establish connections within the criminal network.
But it wasn't long before he graduated to more serious crimes, auto theft, for instance.
He had a particular fondness for luxury cars. Pierce Arrows, Cadillacs, Packards, the symbols of wealth and status.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? An immigrant's son stealing the ultimate symbols of American success.
There's a certain audacity to it, a defiance of societal norms. But Durkin's crimes weren't just about material gain. There was an element of violence that simmered beneath the surface.
And that violence boiled over in December 1924.
Right. 3 Chicago police officers cornered him in a basement, responding to a burglary report.
A routine call that turned deadly.
Gunfire erupted. All 3 officers were wounded, left bleeding on the concrete floor.
It's chilling to think about. This incident marked a turning point in Durkin's criminal career.
It was a descent into a darker realm. The stakes were higher now, the consequences graver.
But instead of deterring him, this encounter with law enforcement seemed to embolden Durkin.
It fueled his recklessness, his disregard for authority. He became even more daring, more ruthless.
He honed his skills, becoming a master thief, specializing in luxury cars.
He would pose as a wealthy buyer, meticulously planning his heists, using charm and deception to gain people's trust.
He preyed on car dealerships, exploiting their eagerness to make a sale.
He'd agree to purchase a car, have it prepped for delivery, and then, under the cover of darkness, he'd slip into the dealership, steal the car, and vanish.
Like a ghost.
Leaving behind a trail of bewildered salesmen and empty showrooms.
And always by his side was Elizabeth Betty Andrews, his girlfriend and accomplice.
Betty, a fascinating figure in her own right, devoted to Durkin, seemingly unfazed by his escalating brutality.
A Bonnie to his Clyde.
Perhaps. They navigated the shadowy underbelly of 1920s America together, living a life on the edge, fueled by adrenaline and a shared disregard for the law.
Their exploits soon attracted the attention of a fledgling organization, the FBI.
The Bureau was still in its infancy, tasked with combating the growing menace of interstate crime.
Special Agent Edwin C. Shanahan, a dedicated young agent working out of the Chicago field office, was assigned to Durkin's case.
Shanahan meticulously tracked Durkin's movements, piecing together evidence of stolen vehicles transported across state lines.
A direct violation of the newly enacted National Motor Vehicle Theft Act.
Exactly. The FBI was determined to put an end to Durkin's interstate crime spree.
And this all culminated in a fateful encounter on October 11th, 1925, right?
Right. Shanahan received a tip that Durkin was expected to arrive at a Chicago garage with a stolen car transported all the way from New Mexico.
So they set a trap.
A stakeout. Shanahan and his fellow agents waited for Durkin to appear.
But something went terribly wrong,
The hours dragged on. Shanahan's fellow officers left for a much-needed break.
leaving Shanahan alone.
It was during this fateful window when Shanahan stood alone in the dimly lit garage that Durkin arrived.
A chance encounter that would have tragic consequences.
We know that Shanahan, badge gleaming in the dim light, attempted to apprehend Durkin.
But somehow the tables turned.
Durkin, a cornered animal, reacted with deadly force.
A single gunshot.
Piercing the silence of the garage, Shanahan, struck in the chest, crumpled to the ground.
At 32 years old, Edwin C. Shanahan became the first FBI agent to be killed in the line of duty.
His murder sent shockwaves through the Bureau and across the nation.
This wasn't just another crime. It was an attack on the very heart of law enforcement.
The FBI, now under the steely leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, vowed to bring Shanahan's killer to justice.
A nationwide manhunt ensued.
Spanning 5 states, fueled by grief, outrage, and a burgeoning determination to prove the Bureau's strength.
Durkin's face was plastered on wanted posters across the country.
Newspapers splashed his image across their front pages, painting him as a ruthless cop killer.
A symbol of the lawlessness gripping the nation.
The public, captivated by the unfolding drama, followed every twist and turn of the manhunt.
And weeks later, the trail led Chicago police to a relative's house where Durkin was believed to be hiding.
They surrounded the building, hoping to catch him by surprise.
But Durkin, ever vigilant, sensed the trap.
More gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness of the night.
Another violent confrontation.
When the smoke cleared, one officer lay dead, another critically wounded.
And Durkin.
He had vanished once again, disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of bloodshed and unanswered questions.
Okay, this is already a lot to process. Durkin's story, while fascinating, is deeply disturbing.
It is. It forces us to confront the dark side of human nature.
It raises questions about the allure of crime, the consequences of violence, and the lengths to which people will go to evade capture.
And it leaves us wondering, how did this all end?
That's a story for another time.
It's a story that really grabs you, isn't it? The danger, the audacity, the moral lines blurred by desperation, or maybe a twisted sense of loyalty.
You're right, it's easy to get caught up in the thrill of the chase. But we need to step back and examine the layers beneath the surface. What made a man like Durkin tick?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What drives someone to choose a life of crime, especially a life as violent as Durkin's?
And what about Betty? What drew her into this world? Was it love? A thirst for adventure? Or something darker?
It's hard to say for sure. Their relationship was complex, to say the least. But one thing's for certain. Betty was deeply devoted to Durkin, even complicit in his crimes.
It's unsettling, to say the least. And then there's Shanahan's murder. That wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a turning point for the FBI.
Absolutely. Remember, this was 1925. The FBI was a young organization still finding its feet. Shanahan's death was a brutal wake-up call, a stark reminder of the dangers agents face.
It was a direct challenge to the FBI's authority, wasn't it? A slap in the face to a fledgling organization trying to establish itself.
Exactly. And J. Edgar Hoover, who had just taken over as director, was not about to let that stand.
Hoover, the man who would go on to become the face of the FBI for decades.
The very same. Shanahan's murder fueled Hoover's ambition, his determination to build the FBI into a force to be reckoned with, an organization capable of taking on the rising tide of organized crime that was sweeping the nation.
And Durkin's manhunt became a national obsession, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The newspapers had a field day. Every daring escape, every shootout, every twist and turn was front-page news.
It's amazing how quickly Durkin went from being a relatively unknown criminal to a household name.
He became a symbol of the Roaring Twenties, a charismatic outlaw who thumbed his nose at authority. It fed into the anxieties of the time: prohibition, social upheaval, the changing face of America.
There was a sense of lawlessness in the air, wasn't there? A feeling that anything could happen.
There was. And Durkin, in a strange way, became a folk hero for some, a symbol of rebellion against the establishment.
It's fascinating how public perception can be so complex, isn't it?
It is. Here you have a cop killer, a man who had committed a string of violent crimes, and yet there was a segment of the population that romanticized him, saw him as a Robin Hood figure.
But for the FBI, Durkin was public enemy number one. Their top priority was bringing him to justice.
Absolutely. After the shootout in Chicago, where he killed an officer and wounded another, they knew they were dealing with someone cunning and dangerous.
So they changed their tactics.
They had to. They expanded their search, alerted dealerships across the country, warning them about Durkin's methods. And they stepped up their intelligence gathering, relying on informants, tips, anything that could give them an edge.
They were determined to catch him no matter the cost.
They were, and that determination eventually led them to San Diego, where Durkin struck again, stealing a brand new Cadillac from a dealership.
The chase was on again, this time across the Southwest.
Exactly. Agents fanned out across Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, following every lead, every whisper. They were like bloodhounds on the trail of a fox.
And then they got a lucky break, right? A sheriff in Pecos, Texas, spotted a Cadillac that matched the description of the stolen car.
Right. The sheriff pulled the car over, approached the driver, a charming, well-dressed man who identified himself as Fred Conley, a deputy sheriff from Los Angeles.
Fred Conley. Sounds like Durkin was up to his old tricks, using his charisma and a fabricated story to slip out of trouble.
He was a master of deception. And it worked, at least for a little while. He managed to convince the sheriff to let him go back to his hotel to retrieve his identification.
I bet the sheriff felt pretty foolish when he realized he'd been duped.
You can imagine. But that close call proved to be Durkin's undoing. The FBI, alerted to the encounter in Pecos, descended on the town.
They were closing in.
They were. They discovered the abandoned Cadillac, wrecked and half buried in the mesquite. And following a trail of clues, they learned that Durkin and Betty had hitched a ride to a nearby town, likely heading for Alpine, Texas, to catch a train.
So the chase continued, this time by rail.
The agents in Alpine contacted the railroad station and learned that a couple matching Durkin and Betty's description had boarded a train bound for San Antonio, where they planned to connect to another train heading for St. Louis.
The net was closing in. It was only a matter of time.
They devised a plan to intercept the train before it reached St. Louis. With the help of local police, they selected a small town just outside the city limits, a place surrounded by open farmland, minimizing Durkin's chances of escape.
The stage was set for a final showdown. Okay, so the FBI had Durkin trapped. What happened next?
Well, as you can imagine, Durkin wasn't going down without a fight. He was armed and ready to use violence. But the agents, along with the St. Louis police, overwhelmed him before he could even reach for his gun. After a 3-month chase that gripped the nation, Martin James Durkin was finally in custody.
I can only imagine the sense of release the FBI has to felt. They finally had their man, the man who killed one of their own.
It was a major victory for the Bureau, a demonstration of their growing power and reach, but there was a legal wrinkle that complicated matters.
Oh, what do you mean?
At the time, there was no federal law specifically against killing a federal agent.
You're kidding, right? So they couldn't charge him federally for Shanahan's murder.
It's shocking, isn't it? It was a loophole in the law, a vulnerability that exposed the risks agents faced. Durkin could only be tried in state court for Shanahan's murder.
So what happened? Did he just get a slap on the wrist?
No, not exactly. He was convicted in state court and sentenced to 35 years for Shanahan's murder. And he also faced federal charges for violating the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act.
Ah, so they got him on those interstate car thefts.
Exactly. That landed him an additional 15 years. In the end, he spent 28 years behind bars.
Wow, 28 years. What about Betty? What became of her?
Betty's story is a tragic one. After Durkin's arrest, she actually married another man, but later divorced him, stating that she would forever wait for Marty.
Wow, forever wait for Marty. That's some serious devotion.
Marty?
Or maybe delusion, it's hard to say.
It really is. Sadly, she died in prison in 1932, just a few years after Durkin's capture.
So both of them ended up behind bars. It's a sad ending to a story that was already filled with violence and tragedy.
It is. Durkin's story, while fascinating, is a cautionary tale. It reminds us of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the seductive allure of crime, and the devastating consequences of violence.
It also highlights a pivotal moment in FBI history, doesn't it? Shanahan's murder, while a terrible tragedy, ultimately led to important changes within the Bureau.
Absolutely. It galvanized the FBI, fueled their determination to combat organized crime and protect their own.
And it led to a significant change in the law, right? The 1934 legislation that made it a federal crime to kill a federal agent.
Exactly. That law was a direct result of Shanahan's murder and other similar incidents. A somber reminder that progress often comes at a great cost.
It's incredible to think how one event, the murder of one agent, could have such a ripple effect, shaping the future of law enforcement in America.
It really does show how pivotal individual events can be. We can draw a direct line from Shanahan's death to the robust laws protecting federal law enforcement officers today.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thanks for taking us back to the Roaring Twenties and shedding light on this pivotal moment in law enforcement history.
It's been my pleasure. I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the early days of the FBI and the challenges they faced in combating organized crime. And may we always remember Special Agent Edwin C. Shanahan and the sacrifice he made in service to our nation.